Hello, my name is David Biale, and I am one of the co-editors of the Stanford series in Jewish Studies. I have with me today Natan Meir, who is the author of a recently published book by Stanford, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, the Destitute, Disabled, and Mad of Jewish Eastern Europe, 1800 to 1939. Natan, I want to ask you, these people you're treating, these sources that you found, uncover a kind of a layer of Jewish Eastern Europe, of the history of the Jews of Eastern Europe that we didn't know before. Can you give us some examples of what you found that are particularly striking in dealing with these marginalized figures in Jewish history?
Sure. Yeah, I think probably the best two examples are ones that run actually in some ways throughout the book. And those are the phenomena of the Hekdesh, the Jewish poorhouse in Eastern Europe, and the plague wedding or the cholera wedding. And as it turns out, both of those phenomena were pretty much ubiquitous throughout the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. The cholera wedding, which was a magical remedy to stop an epidemic, that of course took place only during pandemics, but it happened over and over and over again. And you could find a hekdesh in almost every town and even small cities throughout Jewish Eastern Europe. And yet we haven't heard much about those, if anything, in the existing historiography. It's almost impossible to find anything sustained about the Hekdesh, even though, as I said, it existed everywhere. But the other interesting thing that I found as I tried to sift through the evidence, looking for what was there about these marginalized people, the outcasts of the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, is that while at one and the same time, they are very difficult to find in the evidence. So you can just find fragmentary mentions of their lives here and there. They were mostly illiterate, so they didn't leave very much behind, if anything. But they're also everywhere. So, and this goes back to this question of the ubiquity of these two phenomena that I'm talking about. You can find references to these people in so many different sources. And that's, I think, part of the argument of the book is that they're everywhere in Jewish Eastern Europe because by the end of the 19th century, this Jewish community is so impoverished. That means that, for example, the number of beggars increases exponentially. You have so many poor orphans. You have so many people who are for example, mentally ill who have no one to care for them, or there are no institutions to care for them. And so in some way or another, these people become the face of Jewish Eastern Europe, much to the chagrin of progressives and modernizers and the haute bourgeoisie, who do not want these people to be visible at all to the outside world. And yet, because they tend to live in the open, or they tend to, certainly in cities, in some ways, they are the face of Jewish Eastern Europe, and that's actually goes to the heart of the argument that the book presents.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a heroic work of recovery of a story that nobody's actually told, that really needed to be told. It's also a wonderful, wonderful contribution to disability history, which is also, I mean, there are people working in this in the field of Jewish studies, but it's still maybe a little bit marginal, but this, I think, puts it really right at the center, as you've just explained. I'm curious, actually, why nobody has tried to call a wedding for the coronavirus. Have you heard of anything of this sort?
They actually have. There was a plague wedding in March in Bnei Brak, in a Panovej cemetery. And when I give my talk about the cholera wedding these days, I always end with that. And my conclusion is that the ritual of the cholera wedding was so powerful on so many levels that it continues well past its heyday into the interwar period to some extent, but then it revived during the Holocaust. And then, although I thought we would never see it again, here it is in 2020 coming up. I would love to do, or I'd love for someone to do a little bit of ethnographic research on that and figure out, what are the justifications behind it within that particular community. But it is happening again, at least in one instance.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this is part of a larger story of the survival of Jewish folk practices into our contemporary times that we thought had disappeared entirely. And of course, they haven't. Can I ask you somewhat more personal question? Why did you decide to take on this subject? Or what was the process by which you arrived at this subject?
Well, I think it was a journey, as is often true from my previous research project, which was about the Jewish community of Kiev, which was largely focused on the institution builders of that community, the pillars of the community, whether they be the industrialists, the great merchants, or in some cases the rabbinic leaders of that community, and because there was so much emphasis on the large institutions and the philanthropy in that community, I started to get interested in what the other side would be. In other words, who are the people who are going unmentioned? Who are the people who are the recipients of this charity, who are kind of streaming into Kiev, as far as the sources tell us, by the thousands every year, and yet are mostly living kind of unseen lives underground. They're not supposed to be in the city legally. And so I got intrigued by this idea of the people on the lowest ladder of the lowest rung of the socioeconomic ladder, and I guess maybe there's also a personal piece of it in there for me as well, because I realized as I kind of went through the different phases of the project, how interested I was in marginal identities and people who are living at the periphery of the community in one way or another. And I suppose that relates to my own identity as a gay man in some way. I've never felt particularly, or at least not extremely marginalized, but I think that enabled me to connect to it in some way, the understanding of what it means to be on the outside looking in. And I think that's part of what motivated me. Although if you had asked me 5 or 6 years ago, what the motivation was, I'm not really sure if I would have said that. I think I probably would have just said, this is just the most fascinating topic I've ever studied, and I could probably study it for the rest of my life.
It's wonderful. I mean, it's always so fascinating to see how people retrospectively understand their intellectual journey. And this is a wonderful, extremely important book. And thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you. Thanks.